welcome to Devlog number 30. I know it's been a little while since the last one, but Conquest is coming along really great. I've been taking a little more time for myself, like I've mentioned in the previous devlogs, just so that I don't burn out, but I've been making really great progress over these last few months. Right now, we're about 25% of the way through Phase 3, which is actually the fourth phase because I started numbering my phases at 0 out of a total of 7. About 2 months ago, when I had wrapped up most of the tasks for Phase 2, I gave the testers a secret access to the test build for Conquest. I told them, have fun, go break this, and when I woke up the next morning I had 30 bug reports, so I basically dedicated the whole month of August to finding and fixing bugs to make sure that everything from Phase 0, 1, and 2 were in a good state so that I didn't take on tons of technical debt for later on where these things would be surfacing up later when I could have fixed them now and had everything in a good state. And then with Phase 2 in a stable state and most of the bugs fixed, I moved on to Phase 3, which is actual Conquest mechanics and the start of the logistics system, which is what we're going to talk about for the rest of this devlog. But before we get to that, let's do a quick revisit to new game setup. I want to apologize for some confusion from the last devlog. A lot of people were asking whether it was possible to play against the AI, and yes, Conquest will be playable in single player. That's always been the intention, and it was in the concept document. I just hadn't implemented the setup stuff for the AI team yet, but you can see that over on the right-hand side here. The game, both Conquest and Skirmish, is designed around multiplayer because it keeps things simple and consistent, and I don't think most people realize that a single-player Skirmish game in Nebulous is a multiplayer game with only one client, and Conquest will be the same way. Whoever is a server admin or the host can set up the CPU team however they want as if they were a member of that team just by clicking that button. One of the most annoying things for Conquest testing so far is that every time I've needed a new save file, I've had to rebuild 2 whole factions from scratch each time. So in order to alleviate that, I made these faction templates where we can load and save the faction. It saves everything about it, name, colors, fleet composition, initial build counts, etc. So that should help speed things up a lot. I joked with the testers that the fastest way to get a quality of life feature in the game is to get me annoyed by something. So here you can see me just loading 2 factions really quickly from 2 save files that I made. You can have any number of these that you want, and then you can just create games using whatever factions, kind of like the way Stellaris does it. Now, another new feature in the game setup is these name lists that you'll see at the bottom. So the name generator for the game works well enough. It's funny, it produces some interesting results, but it also produces lots of great inspiration. Usually what I'll do is I'll just regenerate a name until I'm struck by some inspiration and then come up with a name for a ship on my own. But when you're generating 100+ names for a faction, you get a lot of really bad ones. So I added this name list feature that the game will use for generating any ship names when it creates the initial navy and any other ships that you build later on in the game. Up at the top, there's generic names that can go for anything, and then you can also group names by the specific hull you want them to be assigned to. And there's a stock list for both Alliance Navy and Protectorate Navy names. Same thing goes for group names, so when you generate a new task group or task force, it will pull names from this list here. You don't have to select one of these lists, but if you don't, it'll either use the random name generator for ships, or it will just number each task group as you create it. And the really nice thing is that these are just text files. You can create a list of any ship name that you want, drop it in your resources folder the same way you do with badges, and you can just select it for your faction, and it'll upload it to the server. You don't need to have any modding experience, you don't need to have a mod active or anything like that. And now that the new game setup is actually connected to producing a save file, we can get our first look at what the scale of an actual Conquest game might look like. As you can see, there are a lot of ships. This is a 100,000 point game, and I can create any number of any ships that I want using that point allocation. Another quality of life feature that I added here is the ability to define squadrons as part of your task forces. Right now, for Conquest, there's no ship limit in Skirmish, so if you have a task force with 25 ships in it, that means that you can have 25 ships in your fleet, and you have to place a starting location for every single one of them, and you don't get any initial formations. It might not have been apparent to most people at first, but we can't set up initial formations the way that we do in the fleet editor because there's so much dynamic adding and removing of ships to these task forces. So instead what I've done is allowed you to group ships into squadrons and then define their initial formation based on a set of drop-downs. So let's set up a few of these. We'll take our 2 heavy cruisers and make them the leads for 2 squadrons. And then I also want to make a squadron of light cruisers, so we'll group all those together. And then we'll just shuffle some other ships into these groups just for illustrative purposes so you can see how dragging and dropping works. And then once I have my squadron set up, I can select the actual formation that I want them to have at the start of the game from this drop down here, and we get 4 options right now. I might add more, but I'm trying not to make it too overwhelming. Now, the real meat of what I worked on for Phase 3 is stations and logistics, so let's talk about that for the rest of this devlog. As part of this setup for this save file, I did some damage to a few ships, reduced their fuel, spent some ammo, etc., so that we can see what stations can do for us. So let's pull up some information on a few of these ships just so we can see what's going on. So Loom of Carina has had some pretty heavy damage done to it, Summer Prosper has spent a bunch of its 250mm ammo, and then Silver Screen has fired 4 of its 8 Hound Block 4 missiles. The persistence of your force in Conquest is meant to be the primary factor that differentiates it from Skirmish, so any ships that leave battle are going to keep their damage, they're not going to have any ammunition that they expended. And that should add a lot of flavor to Skirmish battles. You're not always going to have a fleet that's in perfect condition every time you go into battle. But we need some way to be able to repair that damage or replenish ammo, and stations are going to be your way to do that. While planets are the primary driver of your war progress, stations are the backbone of your navy. The way that I decided to implement stations is as a kind of sub-point inside of a planet's orbit, so as far as the game is concerned, this planet Emerald and Naval Station Emerald are the same location. The reason I did it that way is because it simplifies a lot of the orders that you need to issue. You don't need to issue movement orders from a planet to a station in that planet's orbit just to get ships to go into port, for example. It also makes it a lot easier to shuffle ships between stations when you need to do different things. This does create some friction when it comes to stations that are not in a planet's immediate low orbit, but I can still do things like define L points where stations might be clustered. Right now, it's not possible to do battle at a station because it's not its own unique point of interest. You can't even capture it currently, but eventually when an attacker arrives at a planet, they'll be able to choose what they want to attack, the planet's direct orbit or any stations in its orbit. Now, let's deal with all these ships that we've got to take care of. So first, I know that Loom of Carina is damaged, so I'm going to right-click and I can send that ship directly into port for the purpose of repair using this right-click menu. So that's simple enough, and you'll see it shows up at the service pier here where it's going to do its repairs, and the number of berths are pretty low right now because this is just a quick testing station I threw together, but there will be more in real larger stations. But that's a little annoying, and when I have 100 ships that I have to deal with, I'm not going to remember which one needs to do repair, which one needs to do fueling, etc. So instead, I created this way where you can select multiple ships and send them into port, or you can just select the entire task force and click this Enter Port option here. And that'll bring up this window here where we can see that we're going to send 16 ships into port in Naval Station Emerald. We can see all the services this station has available at the top here. So we've got repair, which is for components, graving, which is like dry docking, where you're going to repair armor and do refit. We can fuel the ship, we can transfer ammo, etc. Each ship will have a set of jobs that are available to complete, and it'll select the most pressing one automatically. So for the first ship, we've got repair already selected, but if I wanted to change that, I could select that and override whatever the default job is. You can only select one type of work for a ship to be completed in a given turn. The reason for this is that scheduling work on multiple work queues across ships where things can be rescheduled, as we'll see later, and having them shift between those piers is a really hard problem that I'm not ready to solve right now, maybe not ready to solve ever, but we'll see. Once I'm happy with all the jobs that I have selected, I can click this Enter Port button, and all of the ships, you can see it dissolves the group, and all of the ships now go into port. This moored list here at the bottom is where any ships that don't fit at a specific pier will go. Basically, they're inside the protective area of the station and ready to be shuffled to a pier whenever the work is available. The bottom line is that there's tons of stuff that needs to be managed at the strategic level in Conquest, and part of my job developing this is to provide the players with UI that makes doing all of those complex things as easy as possible. And the first example here is that Enter Port window where it'll take all of the work available for those ships and just schedule it for you. You can dig deeper if you want, if you're in a time constraint, for example, but in general, you just enter port. But what does that work actually look like? When I open this next window, it's going to be another oh damn moment like with the order writer, but I promise it's not as bad as it looks. So what I've opened here is the berth schedule, and this shows every ship that's going to be at every berth on every pier in the station and what work is going to be done on it for the duration of the turn. Fueling's not that interesting, so let's just zoom in on the work that we've got going for repair and ammo transfer down here. It looks really complicated, but it's really just showing you all of the things that are going to be done on the ship and what's going to take the most time. So up on the weapons pier, we can see that we're going to unload certain counts of ammunition, and that's going to take a given amount of time. We also have berth shift time, so whenever a ship leaves and a new one arrives, that's going to take up time on the schedule. On the repair schedule, we can actually see what components are going to be repaired and in what order, and that's actually important because if a battle happens at a station while ships are being repaired, only certain components might be completed by then. And the ordering for that repair priority is based on the same DC priority that you have in the Skirmish game. Now there's a lot here, but remember that all of this work and all of these tasks were scheduled automatically when I sent this group of ships into port. And I want to harp on this through line here that I'm trying to pull through all of Conquest, where there's a lot of depth available, but you don't necessarily need to touch that depth if you don't want to. It's perfectly fine if you just want to let the game schedule everything for you, but what if I do want to dig into that depth? What if I'm on a time crunch and I want to make sure that all the things I need to get done do get done in the time that I have available? That's where editing requisitions comes in. So first, let's look at the ships that are going to get refueled. Here I can edit the fuel requisition for a ship. I can shift it below the current level, which will offload fuel, or above the current level, which will onload fuel. And then once I click apply on that, the schedule gets edited and you can see that now we're only onloading 25 units of fuel. Scrolling down to the ships that are on the weapons pier, let's say that I want to change a loadout for this first ship here. So by editing the ammo requisition, I can pick the loadout that's assigned to this ship. And basically what a loadout is it defines for a given hull design what kind of ammunition is going to be stored in each magazine. Selecting the no loadout option, I can actually make it so that I'm going to remove all of the ammunition off this ship. So you can see the blue numbers are what we've got on board right now, and then the yellow zeros are what we want to have on board. These loadouts can't be edited yet, so right now the standard combat load is what comes with the blueprint or the template that you build the ship off of in the first place, but eventually you're going to be able to define multiple loadouts for any given hull class. And then again, once I apply it, we can see everything's rescheduled. We can now see the amount of time that it's going to take to remove all of that ammunition, and it's quite a while. And finally, for repair, by editing the repair bill, I can see a list of all of the modules for this ship that are currently damaged. Using this window, I can select or deselect specific components that I do or don't want to repair. I can deselect entire groups. I can select individual modules as well. And the primary purpose here is that you can shave off time if you're on a time crunch by only repairing what you really care about, or if you're running low on repair parts, then you can take off things that you don't need as well. All of this work that's going to be done on these ships requires supplies, so let's scoot this window down and take a look at what's actually stored on the station that it's going to use for these jobs. By opening up the storage window, you can see a detailed breakdown of everything that's stored on the station and how it's going to be used. Right now you'll notice that under munitions, everything is called ammunition units, and the reason for that is that this game is using the simplified logistics model right now. Conquest will have both a simplified and a complex logistics model because I know that there are lots of people who want to play Conquest who also don't want to have to deal with tracking every individual pallet of ammunition or every unique type of missile floating around in the system. So simplified logistics will take all of the different ammunition types and convert them into ammunition units, which is what you're seeing here. The conversion is based on volume, so if you have a 20 cubic meter missile, that's going to take up 20 ammunition units when you try to load it onto the ship. That's what it's going to consume. Complex, on the other hand, is going to track every individual type of ammo and the quantities present in any given location, and it's really intended more for team play where you're going to have a dedicated logistics officer who loves to do this kind of stuff, not really for single player. I imagine most people who play single player are going to use the simplified logistics. Both the simplified and complex logistics models are actually already implemented in terms of how storage works. Simplified actually sits on top of the complex system because it's actually a conversion layer, but the reason I'm using simplified right now is because it's one thing to create the storage system that can track all of those things, and it's another to actually allocate all of the different ammunition types to the starting station in the quantities that are going to be required. In other words, it's just easy to spawn 10,000 ammunition units for me to play with for testing. Another thing this window provides is the breakdown of 4 number columns that you see. So on hand is how much we have on board right now. Incoming is how much is going to come off of ships that are docked and go into the station storage, and outgoing is how much is going to go out to ships, and then we have a final total that we'll have at the end of all that work. In this case, we actually have a bunch of ammo incoming because we're unloading everything off of that light cruiser and then redistributing some of that to the ships that we're rearming, so we actually end up with more ammo than we started with. And finally, to close this out, let's talk about the actual skirmish encounters and how they work. So in order to do that, let's take this TF5 that we spent the time grouping up ships in before, and we'll move them down to Onyx, where we're going to attack this enemy task force. As the High Admiral, when I go up into the command menu and start to execute the turn, I can see that the enemy AI team is already ready, so when I ready up, the turn's going to execute immediately. Once the ships get there, you'll notice a slight delay before this window pops up, and the reason for that is that there is a 6-hour window between when the first enemy ships meet at a planet and when any other ships can arrive before the encounter is actually triggered. This means there's plenty of leeway for defenders to catch up to attackers or get reinforcements to an area before you actually have to choose which units are going to fight. In this window, I can see that I have TF5 here and its point cost, what the condition of its ships are, what their ammunition looks like, and then if I had any other units that had arrived in that 6-hour window, I could choose between them, but instead, I only have this one to work with. Both sides can either accept or decline battle. If both decline, then the battle is declined. If one accepts and one declines, then the battle will be forced, and if both accept, then the battle is accepted. Once battle is accepted or forced, we'll see this window, which is where we're actually going to assign units. This won't normally show up in single player, but I'm using it here to show how it'll work and for the sake of testing, but in a normal single player game, all the units will be assigned to the local player anyway, so there's no point in even showing it. But in multiplayer, I'll be able to scroll through this list and see all of the ships that are in the unit that I selected to use. I can drag this one squadron over and assign it to myself, or I can just drag everybody over and assign it. I can assign the individual units to other players as well. And basically what you're doing here is you're building out what each player's fleet is going to look like when they get into the skirmish battle. And then once I'm happy with all the unit assignments, I can ready up and start the battle. I'm not going to show that here because it's just an abyssal skirmish battle, so there's really no point. But it does work start to finish. All of these ships will show up in the battle. Any damage they take or ammo they expend will be saved back into the Conquest map when you return. And the last thing I'll show here is that we actually have a battle report log built into Conquest, so any battles that you participate in or your team participates in, you'll be able to see a full log of them in chronological order and see what damage was done, what ships you used, etc. So that about covers where we're at right now. I'm going to continue to forge ahead with the remaining 3/4 of Phase 3. That's going to include things like initial ship lifecycle assignment, so taking a large chunk of the starting navy and making it unavailable for the first few turns due to routine navy maintenance and things like that. Faction traits to make the factions unique. Fuel consumption for ships that are moving, because right now fuel is tracked, but it's not actually consumed when you move. And a bunch of other stuff, but we'll get to that in the next devlog. In the meantime, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.